Good afternoon, everyone from Kuala Lumpur, and a warm welcome to all our participants from around the world who have joined us today. I am Ruzani Osman from the World Bank Global Knowledge and Research Hub in Malaysia. We are honored to have three notable speakers who will give their introductory remarks, followed by our first session on environmental information disclosure by financial institutions, and our second session on disclosure by green bond issuers. Without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Ma Jun, Chairman of China Green Finance Committee and Director of Research Center for Green Finance Development at Tsinghua University in Beijing, to provide his opening remarks.
Great. Once again, thank you very much. On behalf of organizers, I'd like to welcome all of you. I think there are 700 participants to the webinar. Welcome all of you to the discussion on environmental information disclosure, which is organized by Tsinghua University, IFC's Sustainable Banking Network, and also the World Bank Office in Malaysia. This is part of the Green Finance Leadership Program series. As some of you know, in fact, many of you are members of the GFLP program. We started off with this Green Finance Leadership Program 2 years ago, which was organized initially by Tsinghua University Green Finance Center and IFC's SBM. And in the last 2 years, we hosted 4 major events in China, in Morocco, in Astana, and we were able to cover 60 countries with 600 participants meeting face to face. But now, given the coronavirus situation, we're switching our strategy towards online virtual meetings. And this is one of the first online communication events. And I'm sure we'll be doing many of these. In terms of the topic today, it's on environmental information disclosure. Let me just say a few words on the importance of this topic. I always said in the last few years, there are 4 pillars to a green financial system, including products, incentives, standards, and disclosure. Disclosure plays a critical role in the following senses. Number one, with disclosure, the financial markets and the lenders will be able to judge which projects or which asset is green and which one is not green, so that the financial flows can be directed to the right place, which is the greener sectors. And the second importance of the disclosure effort is allowing the government to put in the right incentives. The government needs to know where the money is going. If institutions are directing more resources to the green sectors, they need to be given more incentives, such as in the case of China, we were giving them rediscounting facilities, relending facilities from the central bank at a low cost. And also a lot of local governments were subsidizing the green projects with interest subsidies and also guarantees. And all of these require disclosure. Only if disclosure is in place, the government will be able to find the right projects to give support to. And today's discussion will cover actually 2 types of institutions that will disclose information to the market, including financial institutions and corporates. The importance of financial institutions, including banks and asset managers disclosing environmental information, is that not only themselves need to know whether they are green or not, they should also know whether the borrowers of the banks and whether the listed company they're investing in are green or not. And by doing so, or compiling the information of the borrowers and the invested companies through the FI disclosure, they can actually incentivize or put pressure on the companies to be greener and to be more transparent. That's why we are inviting experts in the financial institutional space to give their experience and discuss options on how to enhance banks and asset managers' disclosure. And of course, many of the underlying disclosure will have to come from the corporates, and the listed companies and the bond issuers are the most important ones to lead in this space. So with that, let me thank all of you, including the participants and also the organizers, for making this effort to launch this webinar, and I'm looking forward to a successful discussion in the coming 2 hours. Thank you again.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, good morning to all of y'all. This is Vivek Pathak. I am the Regional Director for IFC, currently based in Hong Kong. And I would first and foremost like to really thank Dr. Mar. He's been truly inspirational and leading the way, I think, for a lot of us in Asia and now at a global level to sort of take sustainability to the next level. I'd also really like to share my thoughts on behalf of IFC and the SPN. And at the outset, I'd like to thank Dr. Ma again on behalf of the work he's doing with the CFD and for making this possible, and also the World Bank Knowledge and Research Hub in Malaysia. I think the interesting thing, as I say, never let a crisis go to waste. And the interesting thing in this crisis is we're all learning to manage by doing a lot more webinars. We're all learning to manage traveling less or actually traveling almost not at all for somebody like me. I've been in Hong Kong for 4 weeks. And I can tell you when I look out of my window every morning, I see islands that I'd never seen before. So clearly the carbon emissions and the whole trend towards sustainability is being helped. Having said that, I think it also goes to show that we can find new solutions using technology. We can find new ways of doing things and cutting the carbon footprint. And I do hope that some of this trend continues. I'm sure my friends in the airline industry will not be happy with this, but at the end of the day, I'm hoping we can find a balance between less travel, which I think is a big contributor to carbon emission. Now, I'm not going to get into the importance of this topic. I'm hoping all of you all who are attending, and I'm told there are almost 600 people, which I think is the biggest sort of webinar I've attended in my whole career or my life, actually. It's 600 people, so quite an achievement. So thank you again to you all for joining, and especially those of you who are joining from the Western Hemisphere, which is at least 12 or 13 hours time difference with us in Asia. I'll just throw out a few numbers there. I think we are beyond the stage of making the case of the importance of this topic. I think we're beyond that. I think I'm at least hoping we are, and the sense I get is we definitely are. When you are talking to investors, they clearly want to see a business model that works. They want to see that this is profitable, this is viable. And the number I'll throw out here is that according to an estimate by IFC, that if we take the Paris commitments of 21 emerging markets, which are all clients of IFC, the opportunity itself is close to $23 trillion. So that's a huge opportunity. And I don't think that opportunity, this task can be achieved purely by the private sector. It has to be a joint effort between governments, private capital, public capital, CSOs, and think tanks, a lot of research. So it has to be an effort which is truly going to be, I would say, on warlike footing. And that's the only way that we are going to be able to actually reach the Paris commitments that countries have agreed to. I think the good news is that over the past 12 months, at least, we've seen a lot of companies taking sustainability very, very seriously. And I think a lot of it is driven clearly by the vision of their leaders. But also we've seen a significant shift over the last 12 to 18 months with a lot more international capital starting to flow into this space. When somebody like Larry Fink, who manages trillions of dollars for BlackRock, comes and says that sustainability is an important lens, or when Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan says that I think is good news, because at the end of the day, if more capital starts to flow to this space, and I would hope ultimately less and less capital starts to flow into firms that are not maintaining basic standards of sustainability, that's when we're going to have, I think, a quantum shift with companies wanting to move more towards that. So the good news is capital is flowing into the space. I think what's going to be critical to continue the flow of capital is a set of standards and disclosures which are common, because the last thing I think we all want is that money starts to come into the space and then there is greenwashing happening and people get disillusioned and we go back to the old ways. So which is where I think the topic you are discussing today is absolutely critical. And as Dr. Ma said, now this is the second phase. Having standards, having disclosure which people can easily understand and which are comparable is going to be critical. That doesn't mean we have one standard. I think companies, countries, different associations can have different standards, but the importance of disclosing them and being able to compare them is going to be critical. I think, there is evidence to show that companies that have gone on the path of sustainability, listed large companies I'm talking about, they have outperformed the index by, I think, something close to 6%. So that's a huge incentive. And I am hoping that as we start disclosing more and more, it will attract more capital, both equity and debt, which ultimately will mean that if I am a company that is doing a lot of good sustainable work and green finance, I will be able to attract a pot of capital that my competitors are not attracting, which will mean my cost of funding ultimately will start going down. It's going to take time for that to happen. And on the equity side, I'll be attracting a pool of capital which is not coming today to me, which means hopefully my stock price will outperform that of my peers. And that way, I think we're going to have more and more people moving towards that. I think there have been a lot of studies that confirm this, and I think Harvard Business School did studies since 2011. I think there have been 3 studies, which further strengthens the argument that I just made. And I think as we see an acceleration towards green bonds, we are seeing this asset class truly becoming an asset class which can stand on its own. And that disclosure is going to create a lot of confidence, which is what is critical. As new investors come in, we need to create confidence. Now, what is IFC's commitment? We will continue to work with all of you all, our partners, through the SBN. We regularly talk to central banks on this. Just by way of example, last year, which is year ended June 2019, 48% of all commitments for my region, East Asia and the Pacific, 48% were in climate-friendly investments, as against something to the tune of 14% in 2014. Which I think makes me personally very passionate and makes me believe that we can do this. It requires a little extra effort, possibly, but our commitment will continue. We are working very closely with companies to move towards this space. We are working with banks. We are trying to come up with concepts like green equity. But again, in order for us to come up with those concepts, we need the support of all of you all. And very important, we need standards that people can have a look at and get confidence. So with that, again, a big thank you to all of you all for attending this. And I am hoping that we'll meet soon in person. But having said that, I think this is a good example of 600 people that flown across the world. The carbon emissions, I'm just curious if someone can calculate that and put it out there. What are the carbon emissions we've saved by doing it like this? So a big thank you to all of you all. And I look forward to continuing with this. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek, for your valuable comments. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Firas Rad, Country Manager for Malaysia at the World Bank Global Knowledge and Research Hub in Kuala Lumpur, to share thoughts.
So thank you, Rosani, and good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone participating in this webinar. My name is Firas Rad, as Rosani just mentioned, and I'm the Country Manager for Malaysia. I'd like to thank at the outset Dr. Ma, Tsinghua University Green Finance Center, Vivek, and our IFC colleagues in SBN for co-hosting this webinar series. And it's a pleasure to join you at the opening of this webinar and to offer a few opening remarks on behalf of our World Bank Group Global Knowledge and Research Hub here in Malaysia. We certainly live and work in challenging times, as all of you know, as our countries and our global economic system work on managing and mitigating the fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic. And it is our hope that collectively we'll be able to rise to our own expectations and surmount this exceptional global crisis. But while we do so, I think we should not lose sight of the global climate change agenda as well, and its profound importance for the future of our planet. And it is for that reason, as has been mentioned, that we are here today taking a small but important step in that effort to address the challenges of climate change. Disclosure of environmental information by both financial institutions and green bond issuers are a key element to boost investor and market confidence. It reassures investors that their investment is in line with their own principles by providing a degree of certainty in the level of environmental compliance. Financial markets, as you all know, hate uncertainty and will price assets accordingly. Assets with a higher level of green certainty should, everything else being equal, be priced above similar assets with a high level of uncertainty in its green credentials. Now, the World Bank has been at the forefront of this effort around the world. We introduced the first green bond, adopted stringent environmental and social safeguards in our operations, and we were a key participant in the development of the first green sukuk. And here in Malaysia, we are partnering with Bank Negara Malaysia, the central bank, Securities Commission Malaysia, the Malaysia Joint Committee on Climate Change, and the Association of Islamic Banking and Financial Institutions Malaysia. in the development of a national green taxonomy and the sectoral guidelines. Now, a key driver in our efforts is the goal of greater adoption of sustainable finance within the broader financial markets. Continuous innovation in products, services, and the adoption of common standards are important elements of success for this goal to be achieved. So on behalf of my colleagues in the World Bank Global Hub in Malaysia and myself, I look forward to the discussions today as we share knowledge and experiences from market practitioners who are leading experts and thinkers in their respective fields. As part of our continued support in raising awareness on sustainable finance, the World Bank will continue to use this virtual platform for future events. It's certainly very cost effective. So with that, I will turn it back to you, Rosani.
Thank you very much, Firas, for your topical remarks. For our first session on environmental information disclosure by financial institutions, I would like to introduce our moderator, Wei Yuan, Sustainable Banking Network's Asia Coordinator, IFC.
Thank you, Rosani. So welcome all to this first half of this seminar. This session, we focus on environmental information disclosure by financial institutions. I'm your moderator for this session. My name is Wei Yuan. I'm with IFC's ESG team, acting as Asia Coordinator for the Sustainable Banking Network. This is a global knowledge network that IFC has supported for financial regulators and the financial industry associations from emerging markets. So joining me in today's session are two speakers and one discussant. All three people, I would say, have deep knowledge and experience on sustainable finance. They're both practitioners and also thinkers, you will find, and also writers of books and leading reports. They come from three distinctive types of financial institutions: a bank, asset manager, and a multilateral development bank. So bringing the full area of experiences and perspectives. So I'd like to start first introduce our first speaker, Mr. Asallah Ahmed, CEO of HSBC Amana Malaysia. You can see his background and introduction on the slide, but I just want to highlight that Mr. Mohammed's active role in the global sukuk market development. He has originated and executed multiple first-to-market sukuk transactions in Asia and Middle East, including the world's first UN SDG sukuk. So let me just hand over to Oz, as he's called, for your presentation.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and also just a big thank you to the IFC, the World Bank and Tsinghua University for arranging this. And hello to everybody who's out there. I heard there's about 600 people, and a special shout out to the folks who are in South America. So bom dia and buenos dias to you. So when we're thinking about this topic that we're going to go through, and you're going to be hearing lots of presentations, what I can assure absolutely everybody on the call today is that from all of the presentations that you're going to hear about, mine is going to be the least inspiring. So that means that if you can get through mine, you can definitely get through all of the others. So with that said, what I'm going to do is start to talk about at a broad level, because there'll be different levels of, experience within non-financial disclosures on the call. I'm going to try and go through the framing discussion of non-financial disclosures, and then also after that, the specific implementation things that people can look at in terms of adopting it. And when I talk about framing, it's very important that we put the role of non-financial disclosures in the broad landscape of sustainability. So we're all on the same page as I go through this, and so people can reflect where they are with this. I'm going to be using the Next Sustainability Wave by Bob Willard as a framework, and that has 5 stages of a sustainability journey. It starts with non-compliance. So that's folks who don't have to comply or should but don't, and I'll give you an example in a moment. It moves on to stage 2, which is compliance. That's for the folks who are saying, well, I'm just going to do what I need to do, basically. I've been told to do. Then we look at this area called beyond compliance. So people are saying, I want to do more than just comply, but I'm not really sure what. And what I'll tend to do is maybe look at what other people are doing and what seems to be popular. Then there's a part of integrated strategy where sustainability is very much part of a strategic pillar of what a company is doing. And then finally, there's purpose and passion. And what that is where a company has made sustainability the heart of everything that it does. Now, when we look at these broad stages, I want to map those to kind of practices or assumed practices. Now, for non-compliance, actually, we know from the automobile industry, what happens is we've had some cases where people have actually said, oh, we are complying to something, but actually they weren't. So that's actually a practice that occurs, but I didn't want to write that down. But as we move on to stage 2 and 3, we have things that are called common sustainability practices. What these are typically copied practices and immaterial ESG issues. So this is linked to the SASB materiality map, where people are kind of saying, oh, well, I'm doing this thing for sustainability, but actually it's not material for their sector, but they're doing it because it's popular. And then when we move to stages 4 and 5, when we think about practices, we have what are called strategic sustainability practices, unique in their nature and also material. Now, what do these things translate to? And there's a role for non-financial disclosures across all of these. But what do they link to first? The first thing when we look at impact, and some people were earlier speaking about the surveys and the research that was done about impact on financial performance, what we find, and this was linked to the report that was mentioned that was issued by Harvard and written by Professor Ioannis Ionu and George Serafim, that when we look at common sustainability practice during that compliance or beyond compliance space, what you find is that there's no significant association with things like return on capital. However, what's really interesting is that it is positively associated with market value multiples. And also, if you fail to keep up with the adoption of effectively common practices, then performance suffers. Contrasted that with people who are on stage 4 and 5, what you find with folks with unique sustainability practices, there is significant and positive association with financial performance, such as return on capital and market valuation multiples. What's important about all of this when it comes to non-financial disclosures is, one, by having them, actually there's a valuation positive impact, even if you don't really know what you're doing with it. But also when you use it to drive and reflect purpose within an organization when it comes to sustainability, there is a very positive financial performance that can be associated, as well as valuation. So let's explain why that's the case, and we'll move on to the next slide. So why is it the case that even if you just comply and have some type of ESG report, that you're kind of finding that it's beneficial? Why is it beneficial? So if we look at stock returns from 1993 to 2010, if you invested $1 at the beginning of 1993 in a evaluated portfolio of high sustainability companies, you would have found that would have grown by 2010 to $22.6. And what you would find if you did exactly the same thing, but for low sustainability companies, you'd only have $15.4. Now, the reason for that is the change in nature of capital, seeking and searching ESG or sustainable investments. We don't have time to go into why all that's happening. It's a short presentation. But what's important is that it is happening and it will continue to happen. So if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, what you will find is all of the different things that are happening in terms of the nature of capital, with one particular one looking even further into the future, saying that millennials are twice as likely than older generations to want their pensions to be invested responsibly. And that's a very strong indication of the continuing changing of the nature of capital. The point is, again, in terms of framing, what's this got to do with non-financial disclosures? Even if you just have them, there is some type of benefit. So with that, I'll just go on to the next slide. If we're talking about, oh, well, what's best in class? Well, this is best in class. So if we look at 250 of the largest companies by Fortune 500 around the world, and these would be listed, what we find is that 93% of them have corporate responsibility reporting And this is a big growth since the end of 1990s. But what's even more interesting is that from the 93%, 78% of them have integrated reporting, meaning with their financial reports, they also provide these kind of corporate responsibility reports. So what we can see is that the largest companies in the world by revenue are doing this as a standard. And again, there's many reasons, part of which is the changing nature of capital. So with that, we kind of set the frame for why financial reports are important. We've made the point that there's this changing nature of capital. But we've also said if you just have these non-financial disclosures, guess what? There's some type of financial benefit. So if we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to go on to implementation. Before we go on to the slide which goes into it, what I'm going to try and do here is show you that reporting is one part of a larger ecosystem when it comes into sustainability. The framing I'm going to use is something called value-based intermediation, which is being run by 12 Islamic banks within Malaysia, supported by the central bank, which is looking to get Islamic bank to change the DNA of the organization instead of just looking at prosperity or profitability, to be looking at profitability and prosperity with two other P's. So the first P is prosperity, the second P is people, and the third P is planet, looking at the people and planet impact whilst you're making money for an organization. And it's a transformational journey that changes the DNA of an organization. So if we can go on to the next slide with that set up, this is a very busy slide. I'm just going to briefly take you through it. VBI has three components that it looks at parts of the business with. Number one component is what is the strategy and policies, i.e. the board and senior management lens. There's the processes and actions, which is the colleagues working in the bank, their lens. And the last one is KPIs and results. Now, the reason for that is that it's not what you expect, it's what you inspect that gets done. So making sure that there's this reporting and verification process. These lenses are applied to these 6 categories you see in the middle, like a little tree. And what they do, as long as you make sure that they are done with delivering effectively sustainable practices, you will get value that is shown on the left-hand side. These are all of the outcomes. There's a proven way that this happens, and there's literature on it. Now, one of those 6 components, roughly 6, is reporting and transparency. Reporting and transparency is a critical one for all of the others, and it's not just about non-financial disclosures, it's more than that, but non-disclosures is a big part of it. Why? The reason is the moment you give information to external stakeholders that's very visible and very easy to access, and particularly when it's public, particularly when it's unsolicited in nature, and then you need to take voluntary action to make it better, it starts to impact directly organizational behavior and encourages organizational change, even if you're still at the compliance stage, if we think about those 5 kind of stages. Now, it provides a very powerful feedback loop into every. So, for example, let's just take an issue. If we say there is a diversity mismatch in an organization, just as an example, we're not talking about climate now. If you're going to go and tell people that, guess what? People are going to want you to respond to it. Your own employees, your customers, and other stakeholders. It is more likely you will do something. So that's the importance. If you think about the power of that and applying it to climate and other sustainability matters, it shows why it's an important part. But just remember, it's one part. But for those of you who work on this area, really important for you to note that you can be a powerful advocate through that work that you're doing. So to go on to the next slide. So when we look at emerging standards, there's a number of them here. And the point that I want to make is when people are going down this journey, it doesn't really matter. These all provide a method of data sets that you can use. Financial institutions, I recommend a task force of climate-related financial disclosures, but they're different and they do different things. But the point is they inform the data set that go into your financial disclosures, and that's important. I'm sure you've read all of this by now whilst I'm talking and have absorbed it, so we can go on to the next slide. The point is that there's a bunch of them. Whichever one you choose to implement, what's really important in making this happen is the following, which is the governance framework. This is something that has to be mandated from your board, and the senior executive team has to take ownership of it. How it's then implemented is typically through the finance department, and the CFO has to be made the accountable executive, and that's very important. But also senior management need to provide challenge to that group that's putting it together. Why? You need to make these disclosures a mirror to show your warts and all. So senior management need to challenge what's going in there. So it's not just a publicity. It's something that genuinely speaks to issues and sustainability issues. The finance department, led by the CFO, certainly needs to make sure that the businesses and the functions are providing golden source information that they can be accountable to be accurate. And that all requires strong governance to empower them to get the information on a timely basis and make sure it's accurate. Of course, some people who are new to this may choose advisors, and for those of you who are listed, you may require auditing, but you may introduce auditing anyway because you make it mandatory for yourself. But this is a broad framework. The governance of putting this together is incredibly important. It starts from the board. People wanted to talk about the task force for climate-related financial disclosures and how it all gets put together. This is a cheat sheet that I use with board of directors to introduce sustainability generally into their organization with directors within Malaysia, which I've managed to be able to sit with 60 directors so far. Now, what this cheat sheet is who's asking a question, what are they asking and to whom in order to create change within the organization. So I'm going to reflect this back into the little circles you see. Most of you recognize this as the recommendations for the Task Force of Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. The main board has to be asking the CEO, what is the bank's business strategy on sustainability? That covers the strategy part of the circles. And it's very important because even if the CEO doesn't know, believe me, if the board's asking, he'll quickly find out. The board risk committee needs to be asking questions. What are our sustainability risks? How are we managing and defining them? And how are we managing the long-term and short-term impact? That's got to be asked to the CRO, and that covers the risk management side. Because if you've got policies and procedures that answer these questions properly for the board, those are the types of things you're going to disclose in the disclosures. The board audit committee, and I've ring-fenced that because even if you don't want to go down the full line of kind of full sustainability change, as long as the board audit committee is telling the CFO where our non-financial disclosures, you'll get something done, believe me, however good or bad it is. And also to augment that is internal sustainability dashboards, and MI is very important. This speaks partly to the metric side of the TCFD disclosures, but so does the performance scorecards and incentives for the management, which the Nomination and Remuneration Committee will look after and should be pointing at the Chief HR Officer. The final thing is the overall governance, which is the largest circle. How do you make sure that's happening properly? The best way to do that is make sure that you're capacity building your board of directors. The reason is that under governance for the recommendations, the board of directors oversight is a key part of that disclosure. So the chairman of the board has to get the shareholders to give money to capacity build the board of directors and ensure that assessment of the board of directors valuation includes sustainability, and the final one is making sure that the Nomination and Remuneration Committee, on appointing the CEO and key responsible individual, ensure they have credentials on sustainability. If you manage to get those questions asked in that cheat sheet and actions following on from that, you'll find it very easy to start to disclose material things into your task force for climate-related financial disclosures for those who choose to use that type of disclosure. With that, I'm out.
Thank you so much, always, for this excellent presentation. Sorry for reminding you. I think we're kind of a struggle between having every speaker to speak, but then every speaker is really excellent. And thank you so much for your presentation. Next, I would like to introduce our next speaker for this session, Mr. Frederick Samama from Amundi. He's the head of responsible investment. And I just also want to mention a couple of highlights of Mr. Samama. You can see his introduction on the slide, but in addition, I want to mention he recently published a book, The Green Swan, Central Banking in the Age of Climate Change. This is co-written with the bank BIS, the Bank of International Settlements, the France Central Bank, and Columbia University. He also recently spoke before the U.S. Senate at the Democrats' Special Committee on the Climate Crisis. So we'll just pass on to Frederick.
Ni hao, good afternoon, everybody, and I'm very glad to be with you today, and I'd like to thank Dr. Ma and all the organizers. And Dr. Ma is definitely one of the key people on the planet that has a key impact on green finance. So he deserves a lot of credit for that. That said, the first slide will be the executive summary. We all know that ESG investment is booming around the planet. That's a very, very good news. The slightly less good news is the fact that it's still confusing in terms of data and objectives. So clarity is absolutely needed and proper data will help. While recognizing that the data is one step, but then we need to understand the forces behind the risks associated with ESG. So this very dynamic world behind the data is extremely important. In the meantime, what are we doing with data? I will give two concrete examples with the low carbon indexes. It's a technology that we pioneered about 10 years ago. And the Harvard Business Review recently published a paper that says that it's now a 50 billion market. And green bonds, I will elaborate very quickly on the use of data that helped us launch the largest ever green bond fund. We are deploying now $2 billion with banks in the emerging markets. Amundi, my firm, is the leading European asset manager. We are managing now $1.7 trillion. We have integrated ESG since the creation of the firm. So it's not something that we have discovered yesterday, more than 10 years ago. So it means that we have been through a long journey on ESG, and our CEO has recently taken the commitment that all our open-ended funds will integrate ESG by 2021. And we have developed innovative partnerships, not only with clients, but with corporates in order to help them align their portfolios with a low carbon economy. So we strongly believe that we are smarter together than inventing the wheel by ourselves. Yeah, the world is very important in terms of ESG. It's a $30 trillion. And what is more interesting is the fact that it's expected to grow. In the next 2 years, we expect the market to grow from $30 trillion to towards $45 trillion. So it's a $15 trillion increase in 2 years. And Deutsche Bank even think that by 2030, it will represent 95% of the market, meaning $125 trillion. It's huge. It's a tsunami. That said, there is a tsunami, but a lot of confusion. Here is a graph that GPIF has prepared about 18 months ago that showed the correlation on the ESG scores for the 450 top companies in Japan between FTSE and MSCI. There's absolutely no correlation. It's amazing. Japanese companies, two are very well-known providers, they are reaching very different outcomes. The reason behind is that before the data, next slide, sometimes we forget to talk about what are the objectives. We want data, but for what? And here, we think that you can elaborate, you can say that you need the data for three different layers, depending on why you do ESG. We can say that ESG, you can do it because you want to express some values, like gambling, to be Sharia compliant, and so on. The truth is that here, very often you lose money. If you were investing $1 in the US equity market in 1900, this dollar in 2014, 115 years later, was delivering $38,700. $1, $38,000. But this very same dollar into tobacco companies that are not exactly sustainable companies delivered $6.3 million. 38,000, 6.3. So by excluding tobacco companies, you were losing money. And then you can want to express some signals. You don't want to shift your portfolio, but you want to engage, you want to report on SDGs and so on. And for that, you're not looking for additional returns. You're just neutral. You're using your money to send some signals. And third, you can say that with ESG, you can generate some alpha. But here the question is, why is ESG potentially delivering some alpha? And we think that there are three main reasons. The first one is that with ESG data, you can scrutinize the companies on some hidden risks, like a lack of good governance, some scandals behind the radar, and so on. The concrete example is Volkswagen. Nobody knew they were lying, but there was a lack of good governance. So it's a kind of 360 analysis. And corporates are more and more scrutinized, so it's important. Second, corporates are living into environments, and the environment can shift. And so with ESG, you can anticipate, ideally, these norms shifts. A concrete example, you were not paying your taxes at Google 10 years ago, you were a star, now it's more complicated. And third, and more interestingly, corporates have grown massively over the past 30 years, and now society is asking them to be part of the big challenges that societies are facing, inequalities and climate change. And if they don't bring their own solutions to this problem, they could lose their license to operate. But you see that suddenly, by splitting the objectives, we see that we will not look at the same data for the different, depending on the objectives. We know about climate change. We know that so if we do nothing, we increase massively. We know the challenge. We must cost to almost zero by 2050. If we don't, we know as well that about half of the planet will be unlivable, meaning that people will, on a daily basis, will have to struggle with their lives to survive high temperatures and humidity. Now, what is important, and that's maybe the second most important slide for me in this presentation, is the fact that we need data, but we need to recognize as well the links between the data. Because if we talk about the risks on climate change, that would be my topic now, focus, we can say that you have three different categories. You have regulations that are booming, that had started with the COP21. You have more and more carbon taxes or carbon markets like in China and so on. And you have nature as well, with extreme weather events that are booming, or seawaters, sea levels rising, and so on. And you have society, with millennials, was spoken about, technological shifts, migration, or health. All these forces can impact asset prices. So we need the data. And we must recognize as well that these different forces are interacting with each other. And you have a lot of non-linearities here. And that's why we wrote this book about green swans, saying that all these forces are extremely important, non-linear, interacting with each other, and it means that it's almost impossible to write a model on how it will impact asset prices. Two non-linearities interacting with each other. Here you have an example of a major shift. Here is a carbon tax in Europe. You see that the price has been multiplied by 5 over the past 12 months. Here you have regulations in Europe. In France, for example, diesel cars were representing 60% of the market, and suddenly a mayor of Paris said by 2021 you won't have any diesel cars in Paris. And so suddenly the market has shifted almost overnight. And what is true in Paris is true around the planet. And here you have the migrations. You have 143 million migrants due to climate change just in 3 regions, including 86 million. You can imagine that the impacts on the policies will be massive. For example, if 10% of the African people are moving north, it means that Europe will have to receive 8.6 million migrants. It will have massive impacts on the policies. And here you have the climate change physical risks. We tend to forget them, but they have been multiplied by 4 over the past 40 years. You have more and more typhoons, droughts, and so on. And what is more problematic is the fact that you have an insurance gap. When something happens, insurance companies are covering only part of the cost. It's a 56% insurance gap in the US, and even 92% in Asia, and 97% in Africa. And so now, once we've said that, we said, okay, there is a boom. We need to clarify the objectives. We need to recognize that we need data, but links between the data. What can we already do right now? And here I would like to share in the next 5 minutes the 2 concrete examples that Amundi has implemented over the years. The first one is that back in 2011, we were challenged by one of the most sophisticated investors in Europe, the Swedish pension fund AP4, to set up a very straightforward, low-cost, scalable, transparent solution to reduce climate change risks. And the technology I will describe as I said, is mentioned in the Harvard Business Review of May, June last year, is now being used for $50 billion. So it's pretty impressive. So the idea is super simple. You all know that a lot of investors are using passive products, MSCI, FTSE, whatever. What we can do is that we can take an index and analyze the constituents of the index. We take the S&P 500 and we scrutinize the 500 elements. And what we can do is that we can extract the most exposed companies to climate change and replace them with their peers that are better positioned. And we can do it without changing the market exposure. So it means that if nothing happens, as we have the market exposure, investors will get the usual standard returns. At the opposite, if or when climate change risk will be priced, then the polluting companies will be penalized, and if you have excluded some of them, you will outperform. And concretely, we can reduce by 50% the carbon emissions intensity, we can reduce by 68% the carbon reserve intensity with a tracking error of 76 basis points. And the good news is that although it was a prototype, it has actually worked pretty well. Over the past 10 years, it has outperformed the market by more than 30 basis points around the planet. And for passive products, where usually you try to outperform by 1 or 2 basis points, 30 basis points is a massive amount. So now this technology that we pioneered, again, 10 years ago, is being used by CalSTRS, New York Common Retirement Fund, GPIF, or New Zealand Superannuation Fund. Here, I would like to share with you another use of data dedicated to how to finance green infrastructures in emerging markets. We all know that there are massive needs, and on the one hand, and that we have pools of assets in developed markets on the other hand. And the wrong allocation of capital is costly for both parties. IFC, we developed a prototype that is now being used by AIB around the planet. The idea is super simple. We have the asset owners, and they were facing two problems. The first one, they didn't want to invest into emerging markets, recognizing that it's sometimes too risky. The second problem is that they don't know about infrastructures. There's a lack of knowledge. And so with IFC, what we set up is the following program. You have the asset owners on the right. They're subscribing to a green bond fund being managed by Amundi. And this fund benefits from a risk-sharing mechanism. So it tackles the problem number one, it's too risky to invest into emerging markets. But then the moment of genius of IFC was to say this fund will invest into green bonds. And by it being issued by financial institutions in emerging markets. By doing that, the banks will collect the money from the investors. The investors will have the risks associated with the balance sheets of the banks. But being just a green bond, the banks will channel the money towards the green infrastructure projects. So we are decoupling the risks from the channeling of the money. So we ramp up the program over the next 7 years. We can say that we have avoided 233 tons of CO2 per 1 million euros. That's why we need the data. We can disclose, the countries and the CO2 avoided per country. And as we have some data as well, we can check that we are aligned with the SDGs. And to conclude, this project is more than a project because it's a new way of thinking about the roles of developing banks. Forever, developing banks have used their balance sheets to finance some infrastructure projects. Here, we have a case study where a developing bank is using its own money to partner with the private sector to set up a prototype that becomes available for all the investors, and all these investors will play the roles that these developing banks would have played otherwise. So it's a fantastic leverage effect. And for that, we need the data. And it's working so well that we have already won 6 awards on this deal. And Xavier Muscat, the former head of the French Treasury and the former chief of staff of President Sarkozy, presented this initiative in a G20 report, having been delivered to the Vice Prime Minister of Singapore. So to conclude my presentation, I would like to say, yes, there's a tsunami around the planet in terms of sustainable investment. Still, so we won the battle one. The battle two is about clarity, and being part of clarity, the data. And then we need to understand the links between the data, and we need to provide some concrete investment vehicles to the clients in order to help them shift their money towards a sustainable capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frederick. I think that ending slides also connects nicely to the next presentation. You talk about the private sector role, private sector approach. We hear from Amundi and the HSBC on how they've handled environmental information disclosure. But not last but not least in this session, I would like to introduce my colleague at IFC, Dr. Shi, or Stone as we call him. Now you'll be hearing from a development bank's perspective, IFC's own experience. Stone is a senior environmental specialist focusing IFC's investment in financial institutions in Asia. He has over 2 decades of experience in this sector, and he's one of the earliest IFC specialists to look at E&S risk among financial institutions in emerging markets. I'd like to invite Stone, please.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Wei. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this virtual panel. I also want to congratulate my colleagues here, HSBC and Amundi, for their efforts and achievements in the ESG area, including environmental disclosure. But before I start my own talk about IFC, maybe I can make some quick comments about what I heard from Frederick and Oates. I think Frederick did a very interesting presentation. I like the kind of a data objective perspective. That's it gives us people in a different kind of thinking about what the purpose, what are the objective behind. It's really insightful. I like that framework, although I still need time to understand better. But Frederick emphasized more and more about the importance of data, but then where the data is coming from. It must be from disclosure by different entities. Might be FI, might be from the regulators, might be about the nature, right? So again, I think this is a really excellent presentation, shows how important the data is and the disclosure is that can help drive new business, right, to protect our planet, right? And then the O's presentation also, like that sort of framing stages. That's quite exciting. I read some literature in a similar kind of hierarchy or progressive investing. O's suggests that there's a correlation at the stage 4 or 5 level. You will see a correlation between the disclosure, right, of whoever disclosed and their financial performances. So this is kind of quite interesting. You can't say, by disclosure itself, that can, make a better financial return. From a statistical perspective, right, I would see this is we call it spurious correlations, right? Financial performance disclosure. But what key is we call the underlying elements. We call latent variable. That's really the management quality. That's the ability to manage all kinds of environmental risks and performances. That drives both, a good environmental disclosure and also a good financial performances. This is really exciting, and we see from O's presentation, we see additional evidence about how good environmental management can lead to good financial performances. Okay, let me quickly stop here, and then I can do a quick presentation, well, not really presentation, about how we do the disclosure, reporting or disclosure related to our work when we assess our FI investment activities. Yeah, this is a slide. Well, this is a quick snapshot of IFC Sustainability Policy Framework, and this is publicly available. Disclosure itself is disclosure policy, the overarching policy that defines the scope of information IFC made available to the public, either as a routine way or upon request by stakeholders. Right? So IFC disclosure policy has a requirement for both FIs, both ourselves and FI clients. Yeah, okay, this is IFC access to information policy, also called disclosure policy, informal. Okay, this is IFC performance standards. I want to spend maybe 1 minute on this. IFC performance standards provides really a performance-based framework for IFC clients to assess, manage the E&S risk and the impacts of their activities that are supported by IFC financing. Any of these performance standards, we've got 8 here, right, also include some relevant disclosure, or more probably, I would say, information sharing or communications requirement with various stakeholders, including, for example, project-affected people and communities and workers. And I'll emphasize PS1, the assessment and management of E&S risks and impacts, is very important for FIs, as it requires clearly that IFC FI clients all need to have an environmental and social risk management system in place. I'll talk about that a bit more. This slide really shows, I want to have this picture here to show our approach to our FI investment activities. So the left side is really IFC direct investment, where IFC performance standards will directly required. The right side is really the IFC kind of investment to FIs, like either through loan, equity, or other financial services, right? So FI got IFC money or support, then they on-lend or invest in, like we call a sub-project. It could be in a large, high-risk project or like small or low-risk project. We have different requirements to these, we call a sub-project. Could be just IFC exclusion list, national laws, or IFC performance standards. The thing is that we call the IFC finance portfolio is really the FI's portfolio that's being supported by using IFC funds. Typically, IFC's E&S requirement, including maybe disclosure, is only related to the IFC supported portfolio. So I want to emphasize that point because people often got confused about, where IFC's requirement will be applied to the FI's own portfolio. IFC requires, as the EFMS stands for Environmental Social Risk Management System. IFC requires all the FIs we invest to have a system in place to manage the risk. And so I first spent time on discuss the previous two presenters, right? So here is more like FI disclosure reporting. Here I use disclosure and reporting interchangeably because you could argue that the disclosure is just a special form of reporting, or vice versa, right? Let me go through some, I say, good practice or requirement here. Bullet one is really, we will require the FIs we invest in need to comply with applicable national laws that relate to E&S disclosure. That's a no-brainer. They have to go do that, right? For example, some countries already have specific laws or regulations related to the FI's disclosure itself. For example, China has a green credit policy that has some disclosure requirement for FIs. The second bullet point is really say, we would expect or require the FI to require their borrower or sub-project to disclose following whose country's national laws relate to disclosure. For example, almost all countries will have environmental impact assessment law. That law probably require the company or project to disclose locally to the locally affected communities such that they have opportunity to participate or review the project, provide this feedback to the government for decision making. The third bullet point, we require IFC clients to establish a stakeholder engagement or communications mechanism. And this communication mechanism is like two-way. So when we talk about disclosure, typically we think of one way, but stakeholder engagement or communication mechanism has a two-way dialogue. So we require that, particularly for FIs that we consider high risk. That means they're doing high-risk activities. As a good practice, we always push or recommend our client, FI client, to have internal reporting to their own senior management, other internal audience, like credit portfolio management. This is part of the governance structure Oz mentioned earlier. And the next one will be disclose report to IFC as an investor on E&S form. That's obvious, right? We may require the FI to tell us what's their E&S policy, risk management approach. What does their portfolio look like? For example, sectoral breakdowns, like high-risk activities, exposure to coal, exposure to IFC, we call it exclusion list, and even the material accident happened during the year, right? Such that we know the E&S performance of the FI. This might be unique to the DFIs like IFC because we have the broad mandate of development. And then many of our FI clients can voluntarily adopt some industry standards. And here you already heard green bond principles, maybe equator principles. Yeah, there are lots of these industry-related initiatives. Even the global reporting initiative is another example. But finally, I will stop here, is that we see the disclosure would be best incorporate a FI's environmental and social risk management system. experience shows that such requirements or good practices, right, if it's not formalized or institutionalized, it will never get truly implemented. And this should be, again, part of the FI's governance structure or management system. Right? And last word to say, if this disclosure or environmental social risk management system is a good quality, with that, you can attract international investors like IFC. Let me stop here. Maybe where you say you have questions to ask, right?
Yep. Thank you very much, Stone. Thank you. And that's a good input and also helpful in linking the earlier presentations from Oz and also Frederick. Now, we don't have too much time, unfortunately, for questions. Our team has actually picked one question that was submitted from Slido. I would like to pose the question to all three speakers, and can I ask each speaker to hopefully give a short answer in 2 to 3 sentences so we can move on to the next session. This question is really on standards and best practices. I think all of you touch upon this in your presentations. The question is, what environmental data disclosure standards, protocols, and ratings are the most advanced or considered best practice globally? And these should also generate, involve low greenwashing risks. So it's a question about standards, ratings, and best practices. Can I ask Oz to answer first, and then Frederick, and then Stone? But I would just kind of ask you to limit your answer to be a really short one. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Just before I answer that question, just to mention on Stone's point, my presentation was noting that particular practices lead to superior returns or so on and so forth. That's the causal link. The correlation, there is some correlation links as well associated to that. So just to clarify that point, it was about the practice. Okay, now when it comes to what is the best standard, it depends who your audience is. Right. Okay. So if you're looking internally and trying to reflect internally, the SASB standards for your sector will help you to understand the impact of the company from an internal view. When you look at externally, for example, aligning with the UN SDGs, you may want to look at the GRI standards, and that's talking about what your impact is on the world. When you're looking at integrated reporting frameworks, that's about bringing the financial, non-financial together and a method to go there. So when we look at data sets, it's important to understand who is your primary audience. So unfortunately, it's not a specific answer to the question because there isn't one, but that's basically my more than 3-sentence answer.
Thank you. Frederick?
So I will try to make it short. I would say that SASB works well. I would like to add another point is to the fact that this data should be freely accessible. Ultimately, what we want to obtain is to put pressure on corporates. For that, we need the mobilization of civil society. And so civil society must access freely to the data. So that's something we have not debated today, but I would like to mention is that too often we have data providers between the corporates and civil society, although it should be a public good. So SASB and data as a public good.
Thank you. Stone?
Yeah, sure. I agree both Oz and Frederick was saying, but I just want to add one point is that we need to see the data standards or practice as an evolving concept, right? There's no best. You got to start with somewhere. But once you set a standards concept in motion, right, it will improve over time. The quality will get better. It will become more relevant. So that's the key things I see is the good thing. We already started this trend, and that's very important. And I believe the data quality standards will get better and better, will meet all the stakeholders' expectations. But it will take some time. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. I guess I would just give a round of virtual applause to all our speakers, and thank you for your excellent presentations. Hopefully in future seminars, we'll be able to have opportunity to dive a bit deeper into each of those standards that was discussed in today's presentation, TCFD, GRS, SASB, and then more time for Q&A. With that, I will just pass back to Rozani. Thank you.